Video 21, Part 20B of 25, Inputs to the Identify Risks process. The purpose of this video is to develop a WBS to present the inputs to the Identify Risks process. The Identify Risks process is the second process in the Project Risk Management knowledge area and is related to the Planning Process group. Please click the like button, subscribe to my channel and share with others. Thank you. How important is the input of project management plan to the PMBOK Identify Risks process? The input of the project management plan to the Identify Risks process is critically important and fundamental. It is not just one input among many, it is the primary source of context, constraints, and assumptions against which risks are identified. Think of it this way. You can't effectively identify what might go wrong in a project if you don't have a clear, agreed-upon definition of what right looks like. The project management plan is that definition. The Identify Risks process doesn't just use the plan as a monolithic document, it draws specific, critical information from its various subsidiary plans and baselines as follows. 1. The core baselines, they define the what, and when. First, Schedule Management Plan and Schedule Baseline. This reveals risks related to timelines, critical paths, dependencies, resource availability, and tight deadlines. For example, a delay in the delivery of a key component will derail the entire critical path. Second, Cost Management Plan and Cost Baseline. This helps identify financial risks, such as cost overruns, fluctuating currency rates, inaccurate estimates, or budget constraints. For example, the inflation rate could increase material costs beyond our contingency reserve. Third, Scope Baseline, composed of the scope statement, work breakdown structure, and WBS dictionary. This is the foundation for identifying scope-related risks, such as scope creep, ambiguous requirements, gold plating, or misunderstood deliverables. For example, the requirement for high performance is not clearly defined, leading to potential rework. 2. Other management plans, they define the how. First, Resource Management Plan identifies risks like lack of available skilled personnel, team member burnout, dependency on a single key person, or equipment failure. Second, Procurement Management Plan highlights risks associated with vendors, such as supplier bankruptcy, late deliveries, poor quality from contractors, or contractual disputes. Third, Stakeholder Engagement Plan helps identify risks stemming from stakeholder relationships, such as resistance from a key stakeholder, lack of support from senior management, or misaligned expectations. Fourth, Requirements Management Plan points to risks of unstable, changing, or poorly traced requirements. Fifth, Quality Management Plan identifies risks of failing to meet quality standards, leading to rework, recalls, or customer dissatisfaction. Sixth, Change Management Plan highlights risks related to how changes are handled, such as an excessive number of change requests disrupting the project flow. 3. The Integration Point. Regarding the project management plan itself, the integration of all these plans itself reveals risks. For example, a highly aggressive schedule obtained from the schedule baseline, combined with a fixed budget, obtained from the cost baseline, and a complex scope is, in itself, a major risk factor. Text: How can an inadequate analysis of the project management plan harm the PMBOK risk identification process? A deficient analysis of the project management plan fundamentally compromises the risk identification process, leading to a false sense of security and a project highly vulnerable to unforeseen problems. The main disadvantages are, first, a reactive, rather than proactive, stance. The project team goes from anticipating problems to constantly putting out fires. Without a clear analysis plan, it is impossible to predict problems. Second, an incomplete and irrelevant risk register. The resulting risk list will be generic, such as the server may fail, vague, and will omit the most critical threats specific to the project's unique constraints and approach. Third, false sense of security. The team may believe they have performed a thorough risk identification exercise, but the main project-specific threats remain hidden, creating a huge blind spot. Fourth, ineffective risk responses. Even if some risks are identified, without the context of the plan, the team cannot develop effective response strategies. The responses will be superficial and will not address the root cause. Below is a detailed analysis of how inadequate analysis harms the process. 1. Inadequate analysis of the schedule management plan and baseline. If you do not identify critical path risks and dependency-related bottlenecks, the team may miss risks such as the delivery of supplier A's API is on the critical path, with no slack. A one-day delay will directly delay our final testing phase. In this case, the project will be constantly surprised by schedule delays. 2. Inadequate analysis of the cost management plan and baseline. If you fail to identify financial vulnerabilities and the impact of cost-related assumptions, you may encounter risks such as our budget contingency reserve is only 5%, but historical data for projects of this complexity suggests that a 15% overrun is likely, which may go unnoticed. In this case, the project will unexpectedly run out of money. 3. Inadequate analysis of the scope baseline, composed of the scope statement and the WBS. If you ignore the risks of uncontrolled scope expansion and ambiguity, the team may fail to identify that the user-friendly interface requirement is not objectively defined, allowing the client to request endless revisions, or that Work Package 4.2.1 was assigned to a junior developer without clear acceptance criteria, which may lead to rework. 4. Inadequate analysis of the resource management plan. If you neglect risks related to team capacity, competence, and availability, the result is that the project may be surprised by risks it should have anticipated, such as our lead engineer is allocated 50% of the time, but is critical to success, or we don't have a plan B for the database administrator, creating a single point of failure. 5. Inadequate analysis of the procurement management plan. If you ignore critical risks related to suppliers and the supply chain, the team may fail to identify that we rely exclusively on a single supplier for an essential component, and that supplier has a history of financial instability, or that the contract with the cloud provider has inadequate penalties in the SLA for downtime. 6. Inadequate analysis of the stakeholder engagement plan. If you underestimate the risks arising from stakeholder resistance or misalignment, the project may be surprised when a key stakeholder prevents the approval of an important milestone. A proper analysis would have identified the Vice President of Sales is neutral regarding this project, but has veto power over the launch date. If not actively involved, she could block the launch. 7. Inadequate analysis of the assumptions and constraints register. This is one of the most damaging errors. Assumptions are potential risks in disguise. If you encounter one of these risks, the result is that the project will proceed based on untested beliefs. For example, the assumption that team members will be available 100% of their time on this project is not analyzed as a significant risk. When this proves false, the schedule collapses. In conclusion, to summarize, the importance of the project management plan as an input to identify risks is, first, context-specific. It moves risk identification from generic, such as something might go wrong, to specific to your project's unique objectives, constraints, and approach. Second, comprehensive. It ensures that risks are identified across all knowledge areas, such as scope, schedule, cost, quality, resources, etc., not just in isolated silos. Third, proactive and foundational. It allows the project team to be proactive. By understanding the plan, they can anticipate where deviations might occur before they happen, making identify risks a truly planning-oriented process. Fourth, essential for effective risk management. A risk register built without a solid understanding of the project management plan is likely to be incomplete and irrelevant. The plan provides the benchmark against which all potential uncertainties are measured. On the other hand, a poor analysis of the project management plan doesn't just make the identify risks process less effective, it renders it fundamentally broken. It ensures that the most likely and impactful threats to the project's objectives, those embedded in its very design and constraints, remain invisible until it is too late to manage them cost-effectively. The process becomes a checkbox exercise, producing a list of minor worries while the project's true Achilles heels go completely unnoticed. As a final message, the project management plan is the single most important input for ensuring that risk identification is thorough, relevant, and valuable to the project's success. How important is the input of project documents to the PMBOK Identify Risks process? The input of project documents is not just important, it is the lifeblood of the PMBOK's Identify Risks process. While the project management plan provides the rules of the game, the project documents provide the actual, specific, and current details about the project that make risk identification meaningful and relevant. Think of it this way, you can't find specific threats and opportunities in a generic plan. You find them by examining the unique characteristics, assumptions, constraints, and evolving circumstances of your project, which are all captured in project documents. The Identify Risks process is about finding potential events as follows. 1. The project documents provide the specific context for risk identification. These events are almost always linked to specific aspects of the project, such as a specific activity in the schedule, a specific cost line item, a specific requirement or technical complexity, a specific resource named in the team. Without these documents, risk identification remains generic and high level, offering little practical value. 2. The project documents also contain explicit and implicit risk triggers. Many project documents are not just data, they are repositories of potential risks. The first repository of potential risks is the assumption log. This is arguably one of the most critical documents. Every assumption is a potential risk. If an assumption proves false, it will impact the project. Identifying risks directly from the assumption log is a fundamental technique. Other repository of potential risks is the issue log. Current issues are problems that have already occurred. They are a prime source for identifying new risks, as they can create secondary or cascading effects. Other repository of potential risks is the stakeholder register. Understanding stakeholders' power, interest, and expectations allows you to identify risks related to stakeholder engagement, resistance, or changing requirements. 3. The project documents also enable a proactive and comprehensive approach. By systematically reviewing project documents, the project team can be proactive rather than reactive. It transforms risk identification from a brainstorming session into a structured, evidence-based analysis. 4. The key project documents and their role in identifying risks are presented as follows. First, assumption log. Assumptions are potential risks. Identifying risks associated with the uncertainty of each assumption is a direct link. Second, cost estimates. The confidence level and basis of estimates reveal risks. A rough order of magnitude estimate has high uncertainty and thus high risk. Specific cost elements may be volatile. Third, duration estimates. Similar to cost estimates, aggressive schedules, high uncertainty in task durations and dependencies point to schedule risks. Fourth, issue log. Current issues are past risks that were not managed. They can create new risks, such as a delayed task now risks impacting a critical milestone. Fifth, lessons learned register. Lessons from earlier in the project or from past projects provide a direct list of risks to look out for. Sixth, requirements documentation. Ambiguous, conflicting, or highly complex requirements are a major source of scope, technical, and stakeholder risks. Seventh, resource requirements. Risks related to availability, allocation, skill gaps, and cost of people, equipment, and materials. 8. Stakeholder register. Identifies risks related to stakeholder attitudes, influence, and communication needs. A resistant stakeholder is a risk. How can a poor project documents analysis harm the PMBOK identify risks process? A poor analysis of project documents doesn't just weaken the identify risks process, it fundamentally undermines it, creating a cascade of negative consequences that can jeopardize the entire project. Here's a breakdown of how poor document analysis directly harms the process. 1. It creates a false sense of security, the unknown unknowns problem. The most dangerous outcome is that the project team believes they have identified the major risks when in reality, they have only scratched the surface. Poor analysis leaves blind spots. For example, a superficial review of the assumption log might miss the assumption that a key vendor will deliver on time as per their historical performance. If this isn't challenged and identified as a risk, the team won't develop a contingency plan. When the vendor delays, the project is caught completely off guard. 2. It leads to an incomplete and superficial risk register. The risk register will be populated with generic, textbook risks, such as scope creep or team member leaves, but will lack the specific, nuanced risks that are unique to the project. For example, a poor analysis of the technical documentation might miss the risk that integrating a new software module with a legacy system has never been attempted at this scale. The risk register might list technical failure, but won't capture the specific, high likelihood integration risk, so no technical spike or proof of concept is planned. 3. It results in ineffective risk responses, or none at all. You can only plan responses for the risks you have identified. Poor analysis means that when unforeseen risks materialize, the team is forced into a reactive, firefighting mode, which is more costly and disruptive. For example, without a detailed analysis of the stakeholder register, the project manager fails to identify a key influencer who is secretly resistant to the project's outcome. This isn't logged as a stakeholder engagement risk. Later, that influencer blocks a critical approval, causing significant delays, a risk that could have been mitigated with early, targeted communication. 4. It wastes resources on the wrong risks. Conversely, the team might focus its limited time and budget on mitigating risks that are unlikely or low impact, while high-impact risks go unnoticed. This is a direct result of not having the specific data from project documents to properly assess probability and impact. For example, the team spends weeks creating a backup plan for a resource who is unlikely to leave because they didn't analyze the project team assignments to see high morale and low attrition, while completely missing a critical dependency on a third-party component with a known unstable API, because they didn't analyze the requirements documentation in detail. 5. It fosters reactive, not proactive, management. The entire purpose of the identify risks process is to be proactive. Poor document analysis turns the risk management process into a post-mortem exercise. For example, the issue log shows a pattern of small quality control failures. A poor analysis treats each issue in isolation. A thorough analysis would identify the pattern as a symptom of a larger risk of systemic quality breakdown, allowing the team to proactively revise the quality management plan before a major defect occurs. 6. Specific scenarios of damage caused by a poor documentation. First, assumption log and constraints. The project may present catastrophic blind spots because it is built on a foundation of unvalidated assumptions. The most severe risks are the ones you don't know you're taking. Second, requirements documentation. The project may face surprises in terms of scope and technical aspects. Unclear, conflicting, or overly ambitious requirements lead to constant change requests, technical debt, and failed deliverables that were never identified as high risk. Third, schedule and cost estimates. The project may exhibit baseline erosion. Risks to the project schedule and budget are not identified, leading to inevitable and unmanaged delays and cost overruns. The team is always explaining what went wrong instead of managing known uncertainties. Fourth, stakeholder register. The project may exhibit stakeholder-induced crises. Risks from opposition, miscommunication, or shifting expectations from powerful stakeholders are missed, leading to political roadblocks and loss of support. Fifth, issue log. The project may exhibit repeat failures. The project fails to learn from its own current problems. The same types of issues keep recurring because their root causes were never identified as ongoing risks. Sixth, procurement documents. The project may exhibit vendor and contractual failures. Risks related to vendor performance, ambiguous contract terms, or sole source dependencies are not identified, leading to legal disputes and supply chain disruption. Seventh, resource requirements. The project may exhibit team and resource bottlenecks. The risk of not having the right people with the right skills at the right time is not managed, leading to burnout, delays, and quality compromises. In conclusion, to say project documents are important is an understatement. They are essential. A risk identification process that does not rigorously review key project documents is, first, superficial because it will miss risks embedded in the project's details. Second, reactive because it will only identify obvious risks, not those hidden in assumptions and constraints. Third, ineffective because the risk register produced will be incomplete, providing a false sense of security and undermining the entire project risk management knowledge area. A poor analysis of project documents doesn't just create a less robust risk list. It severs the connection between the project's unique reality and the risk management process. The team ends up managing a fictional project's risks, not the real one they are executing. This guarantees that the most damaging risks will be the ones that emerge unexpectedly, maximizing their negative impact and minimizing the team's ability to respond effectively. In short, the quality and depth of your risk identification are directly proportional to the quality and depth of your review of the relevant project documents. Skipping a rigorous document analysis makes the identify risks process a pointless academic exercise, rather than the critical, proactive defense it is designed to be. How important is the input of agreements to the identify risks process? The input of agreements to the identify risks process is critically important and often a primary source of both threats and opportunities. While not always the most voluminous input, agreements are a high-impact source of specific, contractual, and financial risks that can have severe consequences if overlooked. Here's a breakdown of why they are so important. 1. Agreements as a direct source of threats. Agreements explicitly define obligations, deadlines, and standards. Failure to meet these requirements constitutes a direct threat to the project. As follows. First, procurement contracts. A significant threat is the possibility of a supplier failing to deliver materials on the specified date, causing project delays. Another significant threat is the possibility that the quality of the delivered goods does not meet the contractual specifications, leading to rework, rejection, and cost overruns. The last significant is that cost-plus fixed-rate contracts can lead to budget overruns if not managed carefully. Second, service-level agreements. A significant threat is the possibility of an IT service provider failing to meet the agreed-upon uptime, such as 99.9%, impacting the project team's ability to work and potentially incurring financial penalties. Another significant threat is the possibility of a cloud hosting provider suffering a security breach, failing to meet the SLA and exposing project data. Third, letters of intent, memoranda of understanding. Another significant threat is that these documents, while sometimes less formal, create expectations. A party may not follow through on the intent, causing delays in funding or resource allocation. 2. Agreements as a source of opportunities. A well-structured agreement can also present opportunities that can be exploited for the project's benefit, as follows. First, procurement contracts. A significant opportunity is that a contract may include early delivery bonuses, presenting an opportunity to finish ahead of schedule and under budget. Another significant opportunity is that a vendor may offer volume discounts, creating an opportunity to reduce costs if project scope can be adjusted to consolidate purchases. Second, partnership agreements. A significant opportunity lies in the possibility of an agreement with a technology partner that can grant access to beta features or expert support, giving the project a competitive advantage. 3. Agreements create secondary risks. The very act of responding to a risk can create new risks tied to an agreement. For example, to mitigate the risk of a key supplier going out of business, which is a primary risk, you decide to engage a backup supplier, which is the risk response. This action creates a secondary risk. The cost of the new agreement with the backup supplier might be higher, or their terms might be less favorable. How can a poor agreements analysis harm the identify risks process? A poor analysis of agreements during the identify risks process is not just a minor oversight. It's a critical failure that can cripple the project's chance of success. The harm is profound and multifaceted, leading to a risk register that is dangerously incomplete and misleading. Here's how a poor agreements analysis specifically harms the identify risks process. 1. It creates a blind spot for high-impact, legally binding risks. The most significant harm is that the project team remains ignorant of the most severe threats and opportunities that are contractually predetermined, as follows. First, you miss catastrophic threats. A poor analysis might miss a liquidated damages clause where the project will be fined thousands of dollars per day for late delivery. The team might treat a delay as a simple scheduling issue, unaware it's also a major financial crisis. Second, you leave money on the table. You might fail to identify an early completion bonus in a contract, missing a clear opportunity to accelerate the schedule and gain a financial reward. The team would never even discuss exploiting this positive risk. 2. It renders the risk register incomplete and misleading. The risk register is the primary output of the identify risks process. If it's built on a poor agreements analysis, it's fundamentally flawed, as follows. First, false sense of security. The register looks comprehensive, listing all the technical and operational risks the team could think of. However, the most probable and impactful risks, the contractual ones, are absent. This leads management to believe the project is in better shape than it actually is. Second, misallocation of resources. The team spends time and effort developing responses for low-priority internal risks while a catastrophic threat, a poorly understood vendor contract, hangs over the project completely unaddressed. 3. It turns surprises into crises. Risks that are identified early can be planned for, monitored, and mitigated. Risks that are discovered only when they trigger are no longer risks, they are active issues or crises. For example, a vendor delivers a component that doesn't meet the hidden, detailed performance specs in an appendix you didn't analyze. This isn't a potential risk anymore, it's an immediate crisis causing stoppages, rework, and conflict. The project is now in reactive, firefighting mode, which is far more costly and stressful. 4. It undermines the entire risk response process. You can't plan an effective response to a risk you don't know exists. A poor analysis at the identification stage has a domino effect on all subsequent risk management steps, as follows. First, ineffective responses. Your risk response plan might be entirely inadequate. For instance, you might plan to mitigate a delay by adding more staff, but the real constraint is a fixed, immovable contractual deadline with severe penalties, requiring a different strategy altogether, like fast tracking. Second, inability to transfer risk. You might fail to use a contract to legally transfer a risk to the party best equipped to handle it. For example, not including a clear warranty clause means your organization retains the full risk of a supplier's product failure. 5. It leads to unmanaged assumptions and constraints. Agreements are full of implicit and explicit assumptions and constraints. A poor analysis means these are not properly cataloged and treated as risks, as follows. First, unmanaged assumptions. The contract might assume a certain resource will be available from the client. If this isn't identified as a risky assumption, you have no backup plan when that resource fails to materialize. Second, ignored constraints. A contract might impose a specific security standard or reporting methodology. If not identified as a constraint, the project team might inadvertently violate the agreement, leading to breach of contract disputes. 6. It fosters destructive stakeholder relationships. Many agreements define relationships with key stakeholders, such as vendors, partners, and clients. A poor analysis almost guarantees future conflict, as follows. First, ambiguity breeds disputes. Without a clear, shared understanding of contractual obligations, every minor issue becomes a potential dispute. "I thought you were responsible for that," becomes a common and destructive refrain. Second, erosion of trust. When a contractual risk materializes as a surprise, stakeholders, both internal and external, lose confidence in the project team's competence and preparedness. In conclusion, to say that agreements are just another input undersells their significance. They are a concentrated source of legally binding, financially significant risks. Ignoring or superficially reviewing agreements during the identify risks process is one of the fastest ways to encounter major, unforeseen issues that can lead to disputes, financial loss, and project failure. A thorough analysis of all project agreements is a non-negotiable activity for effective risk identification. On the other hand, a poor agreements analysis doesn't just create a gap in the risk register, it actively plants landmines throughout the project lifecycle. It ensures that the project is vulnerable to its most legally and financially consequential threats, transforming what should be manageable risks into unavoidable crises that damage the project's budget, schedule, and reputation. As a final message, The input of agreements is vital because it grounds the risk identification process in the concrete, legal, and financial realities that the project must operate within. How important is the input of procurement documentation to the identify risks process? The input of procurement documentation is critically important to the identify risks process. It is not just a minor input but a primary source of significant, high-impact risks. Here's a detailed breakdown of why it's so important. 1. It reveals direct contractual risks. Procurement documents, like contracts, agreements, statements of work, service-level agreements, and terms and conditions, are fundamentally risk allocation mechanisms. They explicitly define who bears what risk, as follows. The first relevant documents are the pricing models. A fixed-price contract transfers cost risk to the seller, but carries the risk of the seller cutting corners or going bankrupt. A cost-reimbursable contract carries significant cost overrun risk for the buyer. Other relevant documents are warranties and liabilities. The specifics of warranties, indemnification clauses, and liability caps are a direct source of legal and financial risk. The last relevant documents are penalties and incentives. Liquidated damages for late delivery or performance incentives create schedule and performance risks. 2. It uncovers risks from supplier-vendor relationships. The procurement documentation defines the relationship with an external entity, which introduces a host of unique risks, as follows. The first relevant document addresses supplier viability. The financial health and reputation of the seller, as identified during procurement, is a key risk. What if they go out of business? The second relevant document addresses dependency risk. The project becomes dependent on an external party's performance. This creates a single point of failure. The last relevant document addresses communication and culture. Working with a third party introduces risks related to miscommunication, time zone differences, and cultural misunderstandings in global projects. 3. It highlights technical and performance risks. The requirements and specifications within the procurement documents are a baseline against which performance is measured, as follows. The first relevant documents addresses ambiguity in statement of work. A poorly defined statement of work is a massive risk, leading to scope creep, disputes, and rework. The second relevant documents addresses technical compliance. Will the procured item or service actually meet the technical specifications? This is a key performance risk. The last relevant documents addresses integration risk. How will the procured component integrate with other parts of the project? Poorly defined interfaces in the documentation are a major technical risk. 4. It identifies logistical and management risks. The how of the procurement is detailed in the documents, as follows. The first relevant documents addresses delivery schedule. The agreed-upon delivery dates are a direct source of schedule risk. Any delay from the supplier impacts the critical path. The second relevant documents addresses change management process. How are changes to the contract or statement of work handled? A poorly defined process is a risk in itself. The last relevant documents addresses payment terms. The payment schedule can create cash flow risks or disputes. How can a poor procurement documentation analysis harm the identify risks process? A poor analysis of procurement documentation doesn't just make the identify risks process less effective. It actively harms it, creating blind spots and setting the project up for potentially catastrophic failures. Here's a breakdown of how a poor analysis directly harms the risk identification process. 1. It creates massive and costful blind spots. This is the most direct harm. The project team proceeds under a false sense of security, completely unaware of looming threats. The unknown unknowns become unexpected disasters. A team that doesn't analyze the contract's penalty clauses won't identify the financial risk of a late delivery. When the vendor is late, the massive penalty hits the project budget as a complete surprise with no mitigation plan in place. For example, a poor analysis misses the fact that the contract does not include intellectual property indemnification. If the vendor's solution infringes on a third-party patent, the project company faces a devastating lawsuit it never saw coming. 2. It leads to the misallocation of project resources. The team focuses on the wrong risks, wasting time and effort on minor internal issues while ignoring the major external ones. It is like fighting fires with a water pistol. The team might spend weeks creating a complex mitigation plan for a minor internal technical risk, while the much larger risk of single-source supplier dependency, identified in the procurement docs, goes unaddressed. When that single supplier fails, the project grinds to a halt. For example, the project budget is padded for internal scope creep, but no contingency is set aside for the cost-reimbursable contract's inherent overrun risk. The project runs out of money halfway through. 3. It fosters reactive, not proactive, management. Without identifying risks early, the project team cannot plan responses. They are forced to react to issues as they erupt, which is always more expensive, time-consuming, and damaging to morale. It may even be necessary to shift from risk management to crisis management. Instead of having a pre-qualified backup vendor identified, which would be a proactive risk response, the team must frantically search for a new supplier when the primary one goes bankrupt, a crisis that could have been anticipated with a proper financial viability analysis of the procurement documents. For example, a vague statement of work leads to a dispute about scope. Without having identified this ambiguity risk up front, the team isn't prepared with a clear change control process. This leads to a costly legal dispute and project delays instead of a managed change order. 4. It results in uninformed decision-making. Project decisions are made without understanding the full risk landscape, leading to choices that exacerbate problems. Imagine a situation where decisions are based on incomplete data. A project manager might decide to accelerate the schedule, not realizing that the procurement contract has strict, immovable milestone dates with heavy penalties. The acceleration effort is wasted, and penalties are still incurred. For example, the team decides to switch to a cheaper component, not realizing the procurement contract mandates specific brands for warranty and compatibility reasons. This decision voids the warranty and creates integration issues, creating new, more severe risks. 5. It severely weakens the project's negotiating position. If you haven't identified the risks in the contract, you have no leverage to negotiate better terms or manage the vendor effectively. You don't know what you don't know. During contract negotiations, a poor analysis means you fail to ask for crucial clauses like better warranty terms, clearer acceptance criteria, or stronger confidentiality agreements. You've accepted the vendor's standard, and often one-sided, terms. For example, when a dispute arises, you are forced to rely on the contract's dispute resolution clause, which you never analyzed. You may find it mandates arbitration in a foreign country under unfavorable laws, a significant risk you unknowingly accepted. 6. It directly causes project failure in key areas. The ultimate harm is project failure, which manifests in 3 core areas, as follows. The first relevant area is cost overruns. Unidentified risks in pricing models, change orders, and penalty clauses lead to budget blowouts. The second relevant area is schedule delays. Unmanaged risks related to supplier delivery schedules, logistics, and integration points cause major delays. The last relevant area is quality performance shortfalls. Failure to analyze the technical specifications and statement of work leads to deliverables that don't meet the actual needs, resulting in rework or a useless final product. In essence, a thorough analysis of procurement documentation is not an administrative task, but a critical, proactive risk management activity. It serves as the foundational due diligence that transforms unknown unknowns into known unknowns, or better yet, into managed risks. By meticulously examining the requirements, terms, and conditions, an organization can preemptively identify, assess, and mitigate a wide spectrum of threats, from financial ambiguities and scope creep to supplier non-performance and legal disputes. This analysis provides the essential intelligence needed to build a robust and resilient risk management plan, ensuring that contingencies are in place, responsibilities are clear, and strategic objectives are protected. On the other hand, a poor procurement documentation analysis doesn't just create a gap in the risk register. It systematically dismantles the project's early warning system. It allows the most significant, legally binding threats to remain hidden until they materialize as full-blown crises, leaving the project team in a reactive, defensive, and often untenable position. As a final message, skipping or rushing this analysis leaves a project vulnerable to reactive firefighting and costly surprises. In contrast, a disciplined analysis of procurement documents acts as a strategic shield, safeguarding the project's value, timeline, and overall success by ensuring that risks are not just anticipated, but are actively managed from the very beginning. How important is the input of enterprise environmental factors to the identify risks process? The input of enterprise environmental factors is not just important to the identify risks process. It is fundamental and critical. Think of enterprise environmental factors as the playing field and the weather conditions for your project. You cannot effectively identify risks without understanding the environment in which the project operates. Here's a breakdown of why enterprise environmental factors are so crucial to the identify risks process. 1. Enterprise environmental factors provide the context for risk. Risks don't exist in a vacuum. They are potential events that are triggered by or have an impact within a specific context. Enterprise environmental factors are that context. They are the internal and external environmental factors that influence, constrain, or direct the project. 2. Key enterprise environmental factors categories and their direct impact on risk identification. Let's look at specific enterprise environmental factors and how they directly feed into risk identification. Regarding the external enterprise environmental factors, we have, first, market conditions. The examples include competitor actions, market volatility, and brand perception. The identified risk is the launch of a superior product by a competitor, altering market share. Negative news can harm the project's reputation. Second, legal and regulatory. The examples include industry standards, government regulations, safety codes, and data privacy laws. The identified risk is that non-compliance with these standards may lead to fines, lawsuits, or project cancellation. A change in legislation may render the project's product obsolete. Third, social and cultural. The examples include cultural norms, political climate, and public opinion. The identified risk is social resistance to the project's outcome. Political instability could disrupt supply chains or funding. Fourth, financial and economic. The examples include interest rates, currency exchange rates, and economic recession. The identified risk is facing budget cuts, increased material costs, and reduced customer purchasing power. Regarding the internal enterprise environmental factors, we have, first, organizational culture. Examples include risk appetite, leadership style, and transparency. The identified risk is that a culture that punishes failure may lead to hidden risks. A low-risk appetite means more threats must be managed. Second, infrastructure. Examples include existing facilities, IT systems, and software tools. The identified risk is related to the reliance on legacy systems presents a single point of failure. Inadequate facilities could cause delays. Third, internal policies and processes. Examples include procurement policies, HR guidelines, and change control procedures. The identified risk is that a slow purchasing process can delay critical components. Restrictive HR policies can hinder the hiring of qualified personnel. Fourth, historical information and lessons learned. Examples include archives from previous projects and risk registers. This is one of the most valuable enterprise environmental factors. It provides a direct list of risks that have materialized before and how they were handled. 3. The consequences of ignoring enterprise environmental factors in risk identification. If a project manager fails to adequately consider enterprise environmental factors, they are essentially flying blind and will likely miss critical risks as follows. First, blindsided by external events. A project could be derailed by a new regulation or a competitor's move that was predictable by analyzing the environment. Second, internal resistance. A project that clashes with the organizational culture, such as introducing a collaborative tool in a siloed organization, will face significant adoption risks that were never identified. Third, operational failures. Underestimating the limitations of existing infrastructure leads to technical risks that cause delays and cost overruns. Fourth, repeating past mistakes. Ignoring lessons learned from past projects means the team is doomed to repeat the same errors and encounter the same risks. How can a poor enterprise environmental factors analysis harm the identify risks process? A poor analysis of enterprise environmental factors doesn't just weaken the identify risks process. It fundamentally cripples it, creating a false sense of security and setting the project up for potential failure. Here's a detailed breakdown of how a poor enterprise environmental factors analysis directly harms the identify risks process. 1. It creates critical blind spots. You miss major risks. This is the most direct and dangerous harm. The project team will be unaware of significant threats lurking in the project's environment. For example, a company launching a new financial app in Europe fails to analyze the regulatory enterprise environmental factors and ignores GDPR. The risk of massive non-compliance fines, legal battles, and reputational damage is never identified. The project is delivered successfully only to immediately face catastrophic penalties. 2. It leads to a naive and over-optimistic risk register. The risk register becomes a list of minor, internal project issues, such as team member may go on vacation, while ignoring the larger environmental threats that can derail the entire project. For example, a construction project identifies risks related to contractor delays but completely misses the risk of a new zoning law, which is a regulatory enterprise environmental factor, being debated in the local city council, which could halt the project entirely. 3. It causes inside the bubble thinking. The team focuses only on what they can control internally, failing to see how external forces can impact them. This is a classic failure in strategic planning. For example, a product team is diligently identifying technical risks for a new product. However, because they didn't analyze market enterprise environmental factors, they miss the risk that a competitor is weeks away from launching a superior and cheaper alternative, making their own product obsolete upon release. 4. It results in the repetition of past failures. One of the most valuable enterprise environmental factors is historical information and lessons learned. A poor analysis here means the organization is doomed to repeat its mistakes. For example, a previous project failed because a key vendor went bankrupt. This lesson was documented but not consulted during the identify risks process for a new project. The new project uses the same type of single-source vendor, and the risk of supply chain disruption is never identified, leading to the same negative outcome. 5. It fosters cultural and stakeholder blindness. Ignoring internal enterprise environmental factors like organizational culture, governance, and political landscape leads to risks that are about how things get done, not what is being done. For example, a project aims to implement a new, collaborative enterprise software. The team identifies technical implementation risks but, due to a poor analysis of the cultural enterprise environmental factors, completely misses the risk of strong user resistance from a workforce that is accustomed to siloed work and is change-averse. The project is technically sound but is a complete failure due to non-adoption. 6. It undermines the validity of the entire risk management plan. A risk management plan built on an incomplete set of risks is not just inadequate, it's dangerous. It allocates contingency funds and management time to the wrong things, providing a facade of control that doesn't exist. For example, the project has a large risk budget for potential overtime to handle scope creep, but no budget allocated for a potential currency fluctuation, an economic enterprise environmental factor that could increase the cost of critical imported components by 30%. In conclusion, enterprise environmental factors are the essential background against which all risks are identified. They are not a passive input but an active component that must be continuously scanned and analyzed. A robust identify risks process explicitly and systematically reviews relevant enterprise environmental factors to ensure the project team has a comprehensive view of both the threats and opportunities that the project environment presents. On the other hand, you cannot identify what you do not look for. The identify risks process is fundamentally a process of environmental scanning. A poor enterprise environmental factors analysis is the equivalent of trying to navigate a ship through iceberg-infested waters without radar, sonar, or a lookout. You might be an expert at steering the ship itself, but you remain vulnerable to the one threat you never saw coming. In short, you cannot do an effective job of identifying risks without a deep understanding of the enterprise environmental factors. How important is the input of organizational process assets to the identify risks process? The input of organizational process assets is critically important to the identify risks process. In fact, it is one of the most vital inputs, acting as the organizational, institutional memory that prevents projects from repeating past mistakes and allows them to build on past successes. Here's a breakdown of why organizational process assets are so crucial, categorized by the types of assets they represent. 1. Process assets and procedures. These provide the how-to for risk identification, ensuring a consistent and repeatable approach across the organization, as follows. First, risk management plan template. While the project-specific plan is a separate input, a standardized template ensures that all necessary elements for risk identification, such as roles, timing, budget, and risk categories, are considered from the start. Second, methodologies and procedures, standardized steps for conducting risk identification exercises, like how to run a brainstorming session or a Delphi technique, make the process more efficient and effective. Third, risk categories, obtained from a risk breakdown structure. A standardized risk breakdown structure used across the organization helps teams look for risks in all the right places, such as technical, external, organizational, and project management. This prevents the team from having a narrow focus and ensures a comprehensive review. Fourth, change control procedures. Understanding how changes are managed helps identify risks related to scope creep and change requests. 2. Corporate knowledge base. This is arguably the most valuable part of organizational process assets for identifying risks. It provides real, historical data from past projects as follows. First, project files and archives, actual risk registers, issue logs, and lesson learned repositories from previous, similar projects are a goldmine. They provide a definitive list of risks that actually occurred, which new projects can review. Second, historical information and baselines, data on actual costs, schedules, and performance from past projects can reveal patterns and areas where things typically go wrong, such as our software integration phases are consistently 15% over budget. Third, lesson learned knowledge base. This is a formal repository of what went well and what went wrong. A lesson like, vendor X consistently delivers critical components 2 weeks late, directly identifies a specific, high probability risk for a new project using vendor X. Fourth, configuration management knowledge base provides information on the status of current organizational standards, which can help identify risks related to compliance or using outdated components. How can a poor organizational process assets analysis harm the identify risks process? Excellent follow-up question. A poor analysis of organizational process assets doesn't just make the identify risks process harder. It actively undermines it, creating specific and often severe vulnerabilities for the project. Here's how a poor organizational process assets analysis can harm the identify risks process, leading to tangible negative outcomes. 1. Repeating past mistakes. This is the most direct and damaging consequence. The damage is that the project team will likely encounter the same issues, delays, and failures that plagued previous, similar projects. They fail to learn from history. For example, a previous project failed because a specific vendor delivered critical components late. Without reviewing the lessons learned repository, a new project team selects the same vendor and is blindsided by the exact same delay, which they could have mitigated or avoided. 2. Incomplete and superficial risk register. The risk identification becomes reliant solely on the current team's knowledge, which is inherently limited. The damage here is that the risk register will be missing critical, non-obvious risks. It will lack depth and specificity, containing only generic risks like scope creep or team member leaves without the nuanced, project-specific threats that historical data reveals. For example, the organization's standardized risk breakdown structure includes a category for regulatory risks. A poor analysis skips this, and the team fails to identify a new compliance law coming into effect mid-project, resulting in costly rework and potential fines. 3. Inefficient and wasted effort. The team wastes time and resources reinventing the wheel. The damage here is that instead of using proven templates, checklists, and methodologies, the team spends valuable time debating how to run workshops or what categories to use. This inefficiency drains morale and budget. For example, the team spends 2 days developing a risk categorization system from scratch, unaware that a perfectly good risk breakdown structure template already exists in the corporate knowledge base. 4. Over-optimism and unrealistic planning. Without the sobering data from past projects, teams tend to be overly optimistic. The damage here is that the project plan, which includes schedule and budget, is built on best-case scenarios rather than historical reality. This sets the project up for failure from the start. For example, a software project estimates coding based on ideal productivity. Historical data from past projects shows a consistent 20% slowdown due to integration and testing issues. Ignoring this data leads to an unrealistic schedule that the team is almost guaranteed to miss. 5. Increased vulnerability to unknown unknowns. A key goal of risk management is to turn unknown unknowns into known unknowns. Organizational process assets are the primary tool for this. The damage here is that the project remains exposed to risks the team doesn't even know to look for. These are the most dangerous kind, as they strike without warning and there is no plan to handle them. For example, a construction project in a new region is unaware that the local soil composition, a fact known from a past, small-scale project in the same area, requires special foundational work. This unknown becomes a major, costly crisis when discovered during excavation. 6. Undermined risk culture and organizational learning. When organizational process assets are ignored, it signals that the organization does not value its own accumulated knowledge. The damage here is that this creates a culture where firefighting is valued over proactive planning. It discourages people from documenting lessons learned because they see that no one uses them, perpetuating a cycle of poor risk management. For example, a project manager who meticulously documented lessons from a difficult project sees a new team make the same mistakes. They become demotivated and stop contributing to the knowledge base, eroding the asset for everyone. In conclusion, to say that organizational process assets are merely important is an understatement. They are a foundational element. A project team that ignores organizational process assets during the identify risks process is essentially choosing to be ignorant of the organization's collective experience. They are doomed to repeat the same mistakes and miss the same opportunities that others have already encountered. On the other hand, a poor analysis of organizational process assets doesn't just create a weakness in the identify risks process, it cripples it. It forces the project team to operate with blinders on, relying on guesswork and individual experience instead of the collective intelligence of the organization. This almost guarantees that the project will be hit by foreseeable threats that it failed to see, leading to cost overruns, schedule delays, and ultimately, project failure. This video is finished, but we will have in the next videos. 1. Creation of WBS for different projects using WBS Schedule Pro. 2. Examples of project plans using MS Project. And many more videos. Don't forget to give a thumbs up if you like this video and want us to continue with new topics. Subscribe to the channel. All content is free. You can also comment suggesting topics you would like to see on this channel. Thank you.